Welcome, nocturnal minds, aboard. Your learning journey starts now. So, picking up from our discussion on how we represent and discover scientific truths, let's dive into a foundational question that has kept philosophers and physicists up at night for centuries. What exactly are space and time? Are they just empty stages where things happen, or are they real players in the cosmic drama? This ontological status is the big one. Newton famously argued for substantivalism: space itself is a thing, an absolute container. Leibniz shot back with relationalism: space is just the relationships between objects, nothing more. It was a classic debate, simmering for 200 years, until Einstein came along and threw a massive wrench into the works. Now, things got interesting in the early 20th century. When general relativity rolled out, many thought, aha, Leibniz was right all along. Space and time seemed to be woven into the fabric of matter and energy, not some separate entity. But then, as logical empiricism faded, the tide turned again. People started looking at Newton's arguments differently, framing them as a respectable inference to the best explanation. You see inertial effects, so you infer the existence of absolute space. It's like seeing footprints in the snow and inferring someone walked there. Recent scholarship, though, digs deeper and says, hold on, that's a bit of a distortion of what Newton actually argued. But maybe it puts Newton in a better light anyway, highlighting his realism about space-time structure. This brings us to another crucial question: causality. Does space-time dictate how rods and clocks behave? Or is it the other way around? Do the consistent behaviors of physical objects somehow define the geometry of space-time itself? That's a fundamental shift in explanatory direction. Let's rewind a bit to classical mechanics. Newton didn't invent everything from scratch. He built on Descartes. Crucially, he took over Descartes' first law of motion, the principle of inertia. Objects keep doing what they're doing unless a force messes with them. Simple enough, right? But here's the kicker. Descartes, despite using this law, had a philosophical account of motion that was frankly a mess. He tried to define motion in two ways. First, ordinary motion, changing position relative to some bodies we just assume are at rest. But which ones? The sun? The stars? Well, they're all moving relative to each other. Second, true motion, motion relative to the bodies immediately touching you. If you're moving, your immediate contacts are constantly changing. Neither definition gives you a clear determinate velocity or trajectory. How can you even say if something is moving uniformly if there's no fixed way to measure its path? Newton saw this contradiction clearly and demolished it in his unpublished manuscript De Gravitation. This diagram helps visualize Descartes' setup. We have these instantaneous snapshots of the world's simultaneity surfaces, each with good old Euclidean geometry. We know the time intervals between these snapshots. The universe is filled with stuff, and within each snapshot parts of that stuff like A, and must maintain their identity over time for relative motion to make sense. So far, so good. But look closely. What links these snapshots together? Nothing. There's no inherent structure connecting the points across different times. Without that extra link, you can't assign a definite motion to body A. It's like trying to describe a car's journey through a series of photos without knowing how the camera moved between shots. You lose the sense of a continuous path. So, how did Newton fix this? With his famous postulate of absolute places. He basically said, okay, Descartes, you're missing something. There are real distinct locations in space, independent of any bodies occupying them. Their relative positions never change. Think of it as a pre-existing grid fixed in the cosmos. This is the additional structure Descartes lacked. How? Look at the diagram. Point P at time A and point Q at time B are the same absolute location. Suddenly, we have a fact of the matter about whether body A is moving, is changing its absolute place. And because we also have a consistent measure of time, we can now determine if that motion is uniform. Problem solved. Mechanics could proceed. But here's the rub, the dilemma I mentioned earlier. Newton's solution works beautifully for mechanics. It gives us the determinate motions we need. However, it introduces something problematic: too much structure. Remember those inertial frames. Any frame moving smoothly relative to absolute space also perfectly describes the laws of motion. Acceleration and forces are the same in all these frames. The principle of relativity tells us this equivalence is fundamental. Yet, Newton's absolute space distinguishes between these frames based on velocity. Is that distinction physically meaningful? Can we detect it? No. Only acceleration matters. So, we're stuck. We needed more structure than Descartes allowed, but Newton gave us more than we strictly needed. It feels like we've gone too far. Is there a middle ground? A way to get the necessary structure without the problematic excess? Let's frame this dilemma again using the language of geometry. Both Descartes and Newton agreed on the basic spacetime structure, instantaneous Euclidean spaces, a notion of simultaneity, and a temporal metric. But Newton's mechanics needed something extra, a way to define straight paths through spacetime, a standard of straightness provided by a mathematical object called a connection. One interpretation is to take this spacetime structure literally, reifying spacetime itself as a real entity with this geometry. That's substantivalism but updated for modern physics. The relationalists, however, push back. They have two main strategies. Either find a completely different theory of mechanics that only uses the Cartesian structure, or find a clever way to interpret Newtonian mechanics relationally, showing how the empirically real inertial frames can be understood without positing an independent spacetime structure. Enter Ernst Mach with his famous bucket experiment. Rotating water bulges outwards, right? Newton said it's because it's rotating relative to absolute space. Mach retorted, what about the fixed stars? Maybe the local inertial frame is determined by the distribution of mass in the universe. This is the core idea behind Machian mechanics. Barber and Bertotti developed a concrete version. Instead of working in configuration space Q where you track particle positions in absolute space, they use relative configuration space QRCS, tracking only the distances between particles. Dynamics comes from finding the shortest paths in this space using a special distance measure derived through a process called best matching. What's cool about this? It's purely relational. Inertial structure and time flow aren't built in. They emerge from the dynamics. It matches Newton's predictions for non-rotating systems, making it more falsifiable. Plus, it naturally explains why our universe isn't spinning relative to distant galaxies. And guess what? It hints at how general relativity might fit into this framework too. Okay, so Machians tried to build relationalism into the dynamics. Another approach is more interpretive. Accept that the equations of mechanics involve inertial frames, but argue that this doesn't mean space-time itself is real. Philosophers like Huggett, working within frameworks like Mill-Ramsey-Lewis, suggest that the fundamental facts are just the histories of relative distances between all particles, plus their masses. If those histories happen to obey Newton's laws in some coordinate system, then those laws are the simplest way to describe it. The relational facts ground the inertial frames, even if the frames themselves aren't fundamental. This leads to that deep question of explanatory priority again. Do rods and clocks follow the laws because spacetime has a certain geometry, or does spacetime have that geometry because rods and clocks do what they do? Some anti-realists are motivated by a perceived asymmetry in classical and special relativity. Spacetime dictates how matter behaves, but matter doesn't seem to affect the underlying spacetime structure. It feels like a one-way street, violating a kind of physical action-reaction principle. All right, let's fast forward to the late 19th century. Maxwell's equations were a triumph, unifying electricity and magnetism. Light, being electromagnetic radiation, was seen as waves rippling through a medium just like sound travels through air. This medium was called the ether. Ether was supposed to be everywhere, filling all of space. Crucially, there should be a rest frame for the ether, and in this frame, light should travel at the same speed in all directions, regardless of the source's motion. This sounds plausible, right? But then came the trouble. Experiments like Michelson-Morley tried to detect Earth's motion through this ether by looking for tiny changes in the speed of light, but they found nothing. Plus, there was a conceptual headache. Maxwell's equations themselves seemed to give different physical explanations depending on whether the magnet or the wire was moving through the ether, even if the observed effect was identical. It looked like a difference without a difference, violating the spirit of relativity. Einstein, in his 1905 paper, saw the solution: how to make all inertial frames truly equivalent while keeping the speed of light constant for everyone. Einstein's breakthrough hinged on a seemingly simple idea with profound consequences: the relativity of simultaneity. Imagine you're on a train, firing a light pulse at a mirror ahead, and measuring the return time to sync clocks. You do this, and you figure out when events are simultaneous. Now, imagine someone on the platform doing the exact same thing. Because they're moving relative to you, they'll end up judging which events are simultaneous differently. Look at figure 48.33. Both methods of synchronization are legitimate, but they lead to disagreement. This means simultaneity isn't some absolute observer-independent property. It's relative to the observer's state of motion. This was a radical departure from Newtonian intuition. From this, Einstein derived the famous Lorentz transformations, the mathematical rules for switching between the perspectives of different observers moving uniformly relative to each other. These transformations ensure both the relativity principle and the constancy of the speed of light hold true. What are the wild consequences? Moving rods shrink in the direction of motion, and moving clocks tick slower compared to stationary ones. Your ruler gets shorter, your clock runs slower. This means distances and time intervals themselves become relative to the observer's frame. But here's a crucial invariant quantity that emerges: the space-time interval, delta s squared, equals c squared delta t squared minus delta x squared. While delta x and delta t change depending on who's measuring, this combination remains the same for all inertial observers. It's the true distance in space-time. Hermann Minkowski realized this invariant interval wasn't just a mathematical trick, it pointed to a deeper geometric structure. Space-time, he argued, should be thought of as a four-dimensional manifold, with a metric, a way to measure the distance between any 2 points. This geometry naturally classifies events relative to any given point P. Events inside the light cone are time-lag related. You could potentially send a signal between them. Events outside are space-lag related, too far apart for any signal to connect them. The boundary is the light cone itself. In this picture, the straight lines representing inertial motion aren't postulated anymore. They emerge as the paths of maximum proper time between time-lag separated points. The elegant geometry of Minkowski spacetime is right there in the heart of special relativity, whether you use fancy coordinate-free math or the standard Lorentz transformed coordinates. So, how does this play out with substantivalism versus relationalism in special relativity? Consider the twin paradox: one twin travels near light speed, returns and is younger than the stay-at-home sibling. The substantivalist says, simple. The traveling twins' path through spacetime was shorter, so less time elapsed for them. The explanation appeals directly to the geometry of spacetime. Now the relationalist, following thinkers like Brown and Pooley, flips it. No, the laws of physics, specifically the Lorentz symmetries they exhibit, constrain how matter behaves. And these constraints give rise to the geometric structure we observe. It's the laws acting on matter that create the space-time geometry. Again, we hit that explanatory priority question. And the asymmetry persists. Space-time dictates how matter moves, but matter doesn't seem to curve or warp the space-time stage itself in special relativity. This lack of feedback is a key reason some remain skeptical of space-time substantivalism here. Special relativity throws a wrench into our everyday conception of time, leading to deep philosophical debates. First, the eternalism versus presentism showdown. Eternalists, influenced by relativity, see time like space, past, present, and future, all exist equally. Presentists cling to the idea that only the now is real. Then there's the tense debate. Tensors believe words like now and tomorrow point to objective features of reality, an objective flow of time. The tensors say tense is just like here, indexical pointing to a location in time, and ultimately reducible to a timeless block universe description. Finally, how do objects stick around through time? Perdurentists say an object is like a worm, made up of different temporal parts existing at different times. Endurantists say no, an object is wholly present at each moment it exists, like a statue occupying its entire volume at once. These views intertwine with the question of whether time objectively passes. If you combine eternalism and detensorism, you get a picture of a static four-dimensional block universe. Change is just variation across the time dimension, and persistence is explained by temporal parts. But does this kill the feeling of time passing? Eternalists say no, that feeling is just subjective experience, like the illusion of movement in a movie. Relativity seems to strongly favor this view, as it abolishes any universal present moment. It also makes perdurantism seem quite natural, while endurantism looks a bit strained in space-time. The tensor naturally pushes back, arguing the relativistic picture is incomplete. But critics ask what extra metaphysical facts are observable beyond relativity. If nothing is observable, why posit them? Putnam famously argued relativity rules out objective passage, though Stein raised objections. The debate rages on. Now for the big leap: general relativity. Einstein wanted a relativistic theory of gravity and a principle that applied to all frames of reference, not just inertial ones. Two pillars emerged. First, the equivalence principle. Being in a uniformly accelerating rocket is physically identical to being in a uniform gravitational field. Second, general covariance. The laws of physics should take the same mathematical form in any smoothly transformed coordinate system. This implies a radical generalization of the relativity principle. Interestingly, Einstein initially thought general covariance was key to the physics, but we now see it's more about how the theory is written down. The real revolution is that space-time itself becomes curved and dynamic. Einstein's field equations elegantly link the curvature of space-time to the matter and energy within it. For the first time, matter actively shapes the stage. What does this mean for the concept of gravity? The equivalence principle leads to a stunning conclusion: there is no force of gravity. What we feel as gravity, the pull towards the Earth, is actually just the effect of being in an accelerated frame. When you're in free fall, you feel weightless, just like in deep space. That's because you're finally in a locally inertial frame where space-time is momentarily flat. The true inertial frames are infinitesimal regions in free fall. This picture strongly suggests space-time is a real dynamic entity, interacting with matter. Substantivalism seems vindicated. Even Brown, who prefers the term metric field realism, acknowledges the geometric interpretation arises from how this field couples to matter. But the Machian dream persists. Can we describe GR purely in terms of the evolution of Sen-D space, suggesting S-D space-time structure itself might be emergent? Now here comes a major headache for substantivalists: the whole argument. Originally a thought experiment by Einstein himself, it was later sharpened by Stachel and presented as a direct attack on substantivalism by Ehrman and Norton. It echoes Leibniz's old worry about absolute space. If space is perfectly uniform, couldn't you just shift the entire universe 5 feet north and have an identical world? Leibniz called this violating the identity of indiscernibles. The whole argument applies this to general relativity. Take a valid space-time solution, G, phi. Apply a smooth transformation, a diffeomorphism, that does nothing outside a small region, the whole but scrambles the geometry and matter fields inside it. You get a new solution, MD, GI, D phi, that's structurally identical, but differs inside the whole. If these two solutions represent different possible futures, given the same initial conditions before the whole, then the theory violates determinism. To avoid this, the argument concludes, space-time points themselves cannot be the fundamental individuating entities. It pushes us back towards Leibniz's concerns about what makes one point this point rather than that point. How do substantivalists respond? Some, echoing Leibniz, argue that maybe we shouldn't care about these purely abstract differences. Swapping identical atoms doesn't create a new possible world. Perhaps we can ditch the idea of space-time points being fundamental individuals without giving up space-time realism altogether. But many physicists, especially those working on quantum gravity, aren't focused on this specific philosophical puzzle. They talk about background independence. In classical mechanics and special relativity, space-time provides a fixed stage for dynamics. In general relativity, the stage itself is dynamically shaped by the actor's matter and energy. This is the core difference physicists highlight. However, this notion of background independence seems distinct from the whole argument's challenge to the substantivalist interpretation of spacetime. It's like two different conversations happening at the same table. For those interested in digging deeper into these intricate issues surrounding space and time, the further reading list offers a wealth of resources. Sklar and Dainton provide excellent broad overviews. Toretti's book is indispensable for understanding the historical context of Einstein's theories. Armand's work is a cornerstone for the substantivalism versus relationalism debate, particularly concerning the whole argument. For specific topics like the conventionality of simultaneity or the arrow of time, there are dedicated works by experts like Malamud, Reinasevitz, Price, Albert, Callender, and Afink. These texts will guide you through the ongoing research and debates in this fascinating field. Having navigated the complexities of space and time, let's pivot our attention to another fundamental concept in science, the nature of species. Just as we question the reality of space-time, we must ask, what are species really? Species are arguably the most fundamental category in biology. They serve two main functions. First, they are the basic units of classification. We group organisms into species and species into genera, like Homo sapiens belongs to the genus Homo. Second, they are the units of evolution, groups of organisms that evolve as a cohesive unit. Darwin famously titled his book On the Origin of Species, revolutionizing our understanding of life's history through natural selection. However, while he showed how species change and arise, his precise account of what a species is remained elusive and controversial. This isn't a recent problem. Biologists have debated the definition of species for centuries, and today, there's no single consensus. Dozens of definitions are bandied about. This lack of consensus raises deep philosophical questions. Should biologists even try to find one correct definition? Or is it possible that there are multiple legitimate definitions reflecting different aspects of biological reality? This connects to the ontological status of species. What are they fundamentally? Are they like natural kinds, like chemical elements defined by an intrinsic essence? Think Aristotle, Locke, Kripke, Putnam. Or are they more like individuals defined by their unique genealogical lineage, like a particular family tree? Think Hall and Giselin. Getting this right isn't just academic. It impacts everything from conservation policy to how we understand human nature itself. The traditional view, championed by philosophers, is that species are natural kinds with essences. This idea, Kant essentialism, has deep roots. It rests on two ideas. First, all and only members of a kind share a unique essence. Second, this essence is responsible for the typical properties we associate with the kind. Think about gold. Its essence is its atomic structure, Yufeng. This structure is found in every chunk of gold, and nowhere else, and it causes gold's characteristic properties like melting point and conductivity. Philosophers apply this model to species, assuming there must be some intrinsic property, perhaps a specific DNA sequence, that defines membership in a species. But biology throws a major wrench into this neat picture. Evolutionary processes actively work against the existence of species essences. Finding a trait universal to all members of a species, easy. Just wait for a mutation to knock it out in one individual. Recombination shuffles genes, ensuring traits universal today might not be tomorrow, and uniqueness, forget it. Convergent evolution gives us wings in birds and bats, evolved separately. Shared ancestry means related species often have similar traits like the prevalence of 4 limbs. Sober adds another layer. Modern evolutionary explanations for variation, citing gene frequencies and evolutionary forces like selection and drift, seem to do the job perfectly without needing the concept of an essence. Positing essences looks theoretically superfluous. If species aren't kinds with essences, what are they? Hall and Giselin proposed a radical alternative. Species are individuals. Think about the difference between kinds and individuals. Water is water anywhere, as long as it's HRO. An elephant, however, requires its parts to be spatio-temporally connected. you can't have an elephant scattered across the galaxy. Hull's argument goes like this. Evolutionary biology treats species as units of evolution. Evolution by natural selection requires traits to be passed down through generations. This requires reproductive connections, parents, offspring, sexual reproduction. These connections necessitate that organisms or their genetic material be physically present together in space and time. Therefore, species, unlike kinds, must be spatio-temporally restricted individuals. What follows if species are individuals? First, the relationship between an organism and its species changes. It's not a member belongs to a class relationship, but rather a part belongs to a whole relationship. Belonging depends on being connected to the right lineage, not on looking similar. Think about family. My son's friend might look just like him, but that doesn't make him part of our family. Similarly, organisms belong to a species because they're connected in the right way. Second, this view shakes up our conception of human nature. If species are individuals, there's no biological essence to being human. Being Homo sapiens is primarily about being part of that specific genealogical lineage. It doesn't require having a certain cognitive ability or language capacity. Those are interesting features but not definitional for membership in the species. The debate didn't end there. Some philosophers tried to salvage essentialism, but with a twist. Boy's homeostatic property cluster HPC theory is the most prominent version. It says members of a kind share a cluster of typical properties, like dogs having 4 legs, 2 ears, etc. None of these properties might be necessary for being a dog, but the cluster is stable enough for prediction. Crucially, HPC theory adds that this co-occurrence of properties is maintained by underlying homeostatic mechanisms, things like interbreeding, shared ancestry, and developmental constraints. This seems like a step forward, avoiding the strict universality demanded by traditional essentialism. But HPC theory faces its own critics. Ereshefsky and Mathen argue it focuses too much on similarities and ignores persistent differences within species, polymorphism. Think about male and female mammals, or caterpillars and butterflies. They differ significantly but are still the same species. HPC needs to account for the mechanisms that cause this variation, heterostatic mechanisms, not just those maintaining similarity. This leads to the broader debate between taxonomic pluralism and monism. Pluralists like Kitcher, Dupré, and Ereshefsky argue there isn't one true definition of species. Instead, there are multiple legitimate definitions, like interbreeding species, amphibological species, and phylogenetic species, each picking out different types of lineages or groups. Monists, however, insist there must be one correct definition waiting to be discovered. Monists object to pluralism, calling it overly liberal or anything goes. Pluralists counter with evaluation criteria like testability and consistency. Molecular data might seem promising for finding a single genetic essence, but counterexamples exist like fruit flies that are genetically very similar but reproductively isolated. Darwin himself was aware of this diversity of definitions, famously writing about trying to define the indefinable. Did he doubt the category of species itself, or just its definability? Scholars debate this. The question of whether there's one species category in nature or multiple remains a central unresolved issue in the philosophy of biology. As we've seen, the philosophical questions surrounding species are incredibly complex and haven't yielded easy answers. Yet, grappling with these issues is vital. Whether we adopt a monistic or pluralistic view affects how we study biodiversity. Understanding if species have essences or are individuals profoundly impacts how we conceptualize human nature. These aren't just abstract puzzles, they touch upon the very foundations of how we understand life on Earth.